The title of this panel is Forest Management in a Changing West, and we're privileged to have Thomas DeLuca, a forest ecologist with the Wilderness Society, Martin Nye, Associate Professor of Natural Resource Policy at the University of Montana, Ellen Engstedt Simpson, Executive Vice President, Montana Wood Products Association, and Rebecca Sosi, Professor of Law at Arizona State University. Our moderator is Jim Birchfield, Associate Dean for the College of Forestry and Conservation at the University of Montana. If you could give our guests a warm welcome.
Thank you, Paul, and thanks everyone for hanging in here on an unbelievably beautiful day. We'll try to move this along as quickly as we can. My job as moderator is to make sure I can tell time, and I think I can do that. And I produced a little 2-minute warning for all of the speakers, so you know if we're getting close. And I'd like to change the format just a little bit to allow each speaker to have 5 minutes after their presentation to be able to answer some questions directly from the audience. I won't give a long introduction, but I do want to say that forests of Montana and forests of the West are critical for not only the future of our resource development needs, for our communities, and for our children, but they're important for all those things that don't talk, all the wildlife, all the invertebrates, all the other organisms that are part of this journey that we take together. And we don't think of them all that often. But of course we have laws that protect them, thankfully, and we have attorneys out here who help protect them as well. So thank you for all your good work. I'm going to start and allow the order of the panel to go as written. We'll start with Martin Nye, we'll move to Tom DeLuca, then to Ellen Engstedt, and finally Rebecca Sosi will close for us. One of the things that I do want to announce is that I know that Senator Tester in his video announced the significance of this conference and some of its outputs. I know that the National Advisory Board of the Public Land Law Review Group has been able to produce a report. I saw the Center for the Rocky Mountain West summary of the Forest Service analysis for the next century that came out recently. And I also want to talk about the report that Martin Nye will be describing here in a moment, the National Forest Policy Assessment that Senator Tester asked Martin and I to produce to be able to look at the future of the Forest Service. I have a few copies of this report in hard copy. It's on the website of the College of Forestry and Conservation here at the University of Montana. That's www.forestry.umt.edu if you want to download a PDF copy of that. Let's begin with Professor Martin Nye. I'm delighted to have him as a colleague and as a friend, and he's going to be talking about this assessment and a new view of the Forest Service for the 21st century. Martin?
Well, it's a pleasure to be here this afternoon. I'd like to thank Jennifer, Mike, Matt, Sarah, and others at the Law Review for their kind invitation for putting together such a fine symposium. It is also an honor and very humbling to share the podium with such an esteemed group of scholars and professionals as assembled here. In January 2008, Montana Senator Jon Tester requested that the University of Montana's College of Forestry and Conservation initiate an outside and independent assessment of selected issues facing the United States Forest Service. In June 2008, Interim Dean Jim Birchfield and myself presented the senator with that requested analysis and a set of policy recommendations. Today, I plan on sharing with you these recommendations that Jim and I are solely responsible for making. We have brought along a few copies of the report. We also have a PDF available at the website. Be warned that it is only a partial examination of some key issues. And undoubtedly, some people will disagree with our recommendations and see things much differently. When we look forward to discussing these issues in a future healthy debate. But hopefully this report is just a start. As we emphasize, a more comprehensive analysis by a more inclusive and diverse set of interests is required if we are to find more durable and mutually agreeable solutions to national forest law and management. Before proceeding with our recommendations, let me first just briefly set the stage as we see it at least. First, the obvious. There remain core differences of opinion as to how the national forests are required and ought to be managed. The executive, Congress, and the judiciary have different answers at different times. These strong disparities of opinion can have a debilitating effect on the Forest Service, whose personnel also differ on what issues should be prioritized by the agency. The open-ended nature of national forest law also leaves the service susceptible to executive-level pendulum swings, with the agency being whipsawed back and forth depending on who controls the White House. The intractable nature of several forest policy conflicts, from the roadless rule saga to the forest planning regulations, can be partly understood in this context, as one administration negates the workings of the last. These abrupt changes in policy direction make it difficult for Forest Service personnel who are responsible for implementing these executive-based initiatives and goals, and leave the agency open to criticism that is without direction and a clear sense of purpose. Criticism notwithstanding, the Forest Service is at a critical juncture. As we explain in this report, never before has it faced so many daunting challenges: global climate change, private land development, fire, water, forest health, recreation. These and other issues pose unprecedented challenges to the agency and lawmakers. The last 16 years, 8 under President Clinton, 8 under President Bush, seems to have left the agency in a state of suspended animation. Several Clinton-era rules were rewritten by the Bush administration, with many of them then set aside by the courts. Widespread confusion and uncertainty is the result. Before launching into additional piecemeal solutions and shallow quick fixes, the next administration will have an excellent opportunity to chart the course for a more vital, confident, and effective Forest Service. We believe that our recommendations, if acted upon by lawmakers in the agency, could move us beyond past conflicts so we can confront a new class of challenging and more complicated problems. So with that background, I'd like to present to you our set of policy recommendations made to the Senator. My limited time means that I must simply lay them out without any background or reasoning provided. But Jim and I look forward to talking about all of them with you in more detail, anytime at all. If you like our report and would like more information, please call me at 543-6126. If you dislike what we've done and wish to share your thoughts, please call Interim Dean Birchfield at 243-5521. So here they are, 7 in total. Number 1. Lawmakers should reinvest in the protection and management of the national forests and fund the Forest Service at levels commensurate with its responsibilities. Increasing demands are being placed upon the agency while it is provided a diminishing budget that goes disproportionately to fighting fire. It often appears that the agency is set up to fail because of inadequate funding for particular activities, from NEPA's mandated environmental analysis to restoration projects, among others. In this context, we make related recommendations regarding the potential overuse of stewardship contracting authority, the need for fully funded monitoring programs, enforcement funding for newly created travel management plans, and adequately funding programs designed to deal with private land development and the loss of forest lands to subdivision. Recommendation number 2, there is broad-based national and state-level support for administratively protecting inventoried roadless areas, and these lands should be protected accordingly. The question of how to make the roadless decision is controversial and fraught with ongoing litigation. But uncertainty aside, let us not lose sight of an important but underreported fact. Almost every state participating in the Bush administration state petitioning process required roadless area protection. Montana has not submitted a state petition, but its Attorney General filed amicus in support of Clinton's 2001 rule, and Governor Schweitzer clearly recognized the vital role that roadless areas play in Montana. Input solicited during these rulemakings make it clear that there is broad-based support from the top down and the bottom up for roadless area protection in Montana and beyond. Number 3, the 2008 forest planning regulations fail to find an appropriate balance between adaptability and enforceable standards and should be rewritten by the next presidential administration. Jim and I are very sympathetic with the problems and challenges faced by the National Forest using the old 1982 planning regulations. But the answer to the planning problem is not to relieve the agency of all legally binding prescriptions, nor to substitute a meaningful planning process for something that is nothing but strategic and aspirational in nature. On a related note, we are also very concerned about the agency's implementation and avoidance of NEPA at the planning and project levels. Number 4, private land development adjacent to national forests is an increasing problem that must be aggressively confronted using an assortment of policy approaches and tools, from fully funded land acquisition programs to landscape-level planning initiatives. We urge the Forest Service to address private land development in its forest planning process, and when it does not, it should expect to be increasingly challenged. The agency should carefully consider what is happening on adjacent private lands and make corresponding adjustments on the national forests. Put differently, when ecosystem goods and services on private lands are diminished, there is a more prominent need to compensate for such losses on federal lands. Number 5, forest restoration begins with a comprehensive transportation planning that identifies and funds the needs for upgrading, maintenance, and decommissioning of forest roads. Number 6, the enforcement of environmental law plays a significant role in forest management and often facilitates the use of less adversarial conservation strategies, from land acquisition to collaboration. If lawmakers weaken or undermine these legal standards, other approaches to conservation will also be impacted. Of course, finding efficiencies in the decision-making process should be encouraged, but the Forest Service should not view their legal obligations as inconvenient procedural hurdles that must be overcome, but rather a set of precautionary tools that lead to more effective and environmentally sound decisions. These laws should be viewed as goals, not constraints. 6B, increasing conflict and uncertainty about national forest management has led to alternative methods of conflict resolution, including place-based, forest-specific proposals, several of which are being debated here in Montana. We believe that questions about funding, precedent, planning, and others deserve careful study and full deliberation before these approaches are replicated elsewhere. Finally, number 7, significant changes have happened since the National Forest Management Act was passed in 1976, and the problems and opportunities evident in forest management require a comprehensive assessment by an inclusive set of interests and perspectives. This is by far our most developed recommendation. We believe that a systematic, rigorous look at forest law and policy is desperately needed. Conservationists, industry, native nations, academics, practitioners, and others have to be involved in finding more durable and mutually agreeable solutions to this complicated set of problems. We have designed a project to do just that, and we hope that if you agree with us, you will join us in advocating for such a large-scale study. There are 4 major reasons why Jim and I recommend and are currently pushing for a comprehensive and well-represented examination of national forest law and policy. First, more than 30 years have passed since NIFMA was enacted in 1976. New laws, planning processes, court decisions, executive orders, science, technology, fire, population growth, private land development, economic transitions, collaborative efforts, motorized recreation, international trade deals, among other significant developments, are but a few reasons why it is time to revisit our national forests and regulations in systematic fashion. Second, a comprehensive and careful assessment is preferable to an executive-dominated shotgun approach or predetermined congressional studies and task forces that are immediately questioned by opposing parties. A comprehensive approach might help us avoid unintended consequences that could result from more partisan and piecemeal tinkering. 3, we suspect that many of the problems facing the Forest Service do not originate in one single law or regulation, but rather from their cumulative nature. A comprehensive assessment will help untangle this Gordian knot of laws and policies and examine how they fit and often fail to fit together. And finally, a comprehensive assessment will generate constructive dialogue among a broad cross-section of interests. It might actually uncover some common ground among various actors. If not, at least it will help crystallize some of the core differences of opinion and force interest to speak with more clarity and vision about where they want to go and why. So in conclusion, as you can likely tell, our report is based on some core values and beliefs. Most importantly, we are unwavering in our support of federal lands and the national forests. Our federal lands heritage provides a wealth of benefits that should be celebrated, safeguarded, and managed for the public interest. Reinvestment is the key word of our report, and we sincerely hope that the next administration, the next Congress, and Montana's congressional delegation embrace this responsibility. Thank you.
Yes, question.
I know that a lot of this has to do with the way the Organic Act is worded for the Forest Service, but you may have consequences on Bureau of Land Management, Fish and Wildlife Service, Park Service, and some of the others, probably screaming, in fact. So I just wanted to ask, what are you thinking about there? Because, people ask me, well, why does the Forest Service have so many rules? And it's because we're 50 years older than the next agency, which is multiple use, which is BLM. So you've got a wide spectrum of lands and uses to address, not just NIFMA and NEPA and some of the things applicable to the Forest Service.
Well, I was looking for an opportunity to shamelessly plug my book.
You're check in the mail.
I agree with you, and in that book of mine, that's one of my final conclusions that, not that it matters, but thinking about this so much that I am in favor of convening another Public Lands Law Review Commission. The last Law Review Commission, 1970, it's the longest period in American history that Congress has not systematically reinvestigated that cumulative body of public lands law. And I think it's definitely time to do it. And I think a Public Lands Law Review Commission is preferable to one focused just on the national forests because we are able to draw lessons from the national parks, the refuge experience, bring in the BLM experience. But I'm not going to hold my breath that that's going to happen anytime soon. But I do believe it's quite feasible to have a very serious, rigorous look focused solely on the national forests. So we're pushing for that.
Is there another question? Yes, there in the back.
Jim, Mark, brilliant.
I'll bring the beer later. All right, Martin, thank you very much. We'll have another round. Now I'd like to ask, and just to remind the audience, we will have a discussion round at the end where we can return to some of these issues, and I'm sure the rest of the panelists will enrich this entire discussion on where the forests might go. Our next panelist is Dr. Tom DeLuca, an ecologist for the Wilderness Society, colleague and old friend, someone whose charm and grace is legendary, and I'm sure he'll spill those for us today. Tom, thank you.
didn't know I was invited for my charm and grace, but I guess I better pull that one together quickly. I was actually a professor of forest soils here at the University of Montana in the College of Forestry for 12 years before joining the Wilderness Society a couple of years ago. And just because this is the land law conference and because I am a soil scientist, I'm just going to give a short pitch before I jump into my talk, and that is the word soil, I think, has been mentioned once today, and it should have a more prominent place in our discussions of ecosystem health and of ecosystem services. There's an illness in this country, and the illness is reflected in the degradation of our soil resources on public lands and on private lands, from overexploitation, from overapplication of fertilizers and pesticides, from salinization, from compaction. We have a crisis brewing with the degradation of our soils. And I'm just going to leave it at that and say I hope somebody comes and approaches me about soils after, during the reception, because for today's talk I'm going to focus on forest health and fire and climate change. Okay. Well, I'll just say I'll tell you what that's going to say. It's a summary slide just telling you where we're headed. I'm going to talk really briefly about climate change and regional impacts with regard to Montana. Then I'm going to talk a little bit about fire occurrence and are things changing from historical conditions. From there, talk a little bit about forest health and resilience of our forest landscapes to these impacts of climate change, and then a little bit about forest management and how we might improve that resilience and address these issues of increasing fire occurrence on the landscape. So I had to borrow this slide from Steve Running, and it just basically gives a nice view of what's happened with our mean March temperatures across Montana from 1954 until 2004, 51 to 2004. And it demonstrates a very disturbing upward trend. Bozeman, Montana, an increase of 7.7 degrees Fahrenheit during that period. These are March temperatures. What's this mean? It means ski season is going to be ending a whole lot earlier, for one, but more important, our winter snowpack is going to be coming off much earlier in the season. Mean annual August precipitation at the same time is declining. And so this is another disturbing demonstration of the effects of climate change, as you look across the state. Each one of these climate divisions are different portions of the state, and it demonstrates a downward trend in precipitation from that period of 1950 to 2007. The implications of both of these are factors like glacial retreat, such as these slides that from Glacier National Park demonstrating the retreat of these iconic glaciers of the park, and at the same time just the loss of wintertime snowpack and the early loss of snowpack and loss of snowpack at lower elevations across Montana. At the same time, we've had an increasing wintertime temperatures so that we are not having those low temperature extremes that we've had in the past. One of the impacts of that, combined with long-term drought and exacerbated by the condition of having many even-age forests, especially those that were cleared during mining activities at the turn of the century, we have a major beetle infestation, pine bark beetle infestation across the state, and this is going to be even more dramatic by next year. Many of us have seen this driving through the Beaverhead Deer Lodge National Forest, for example, red trees everywhere. The fire risk when we have these red trees increases temporarily until those needles fall from the tree. After the needles are off the tree, however, the fire risk is actually lower than that of a green tree or a red tree. So temporarily a significant increase in fire risk. Just to give you some idea of the extent of this distribution, this paper is just out in Bioscience by Rafa et al., and it demonstrates the distribution of these beetle infestations across Canada and Western United States. And beetles are clearly a natural part of these forest cycles, and they do come in cycles, but this current one is extremely large and extremely widespread and owed at least partially to the effects of climate change. Fire. Fire, we've seen the impacts of climate change in terms of fire here in Montana. We have drier, hotter, longer fire seasons. This summer is clearly a little different. It was a La Nina year. It's not out of it's not to be. It was to be expected to be a cooler, wetter summer, given that it was a La Nina year. But since 1986, the Western fire season is an average of 78 days longer than prior to that time. We have a four-fold increase in the number of fires of over 1,000 acres and a six-fold increase in the acreage burned. We're clearly having an increase in the occurrence of fire and the distribution of fire on the landscape, and specifically those forest stands at the mid-elevation range. Fire is a natural part of forest cycles as well, and there's a lot of things about forest fires that we depend upon in forest ecosystems. It maintains cereal species such as ponderosa pine. It also reinitiates secondary succession and the regeneration of a host of species that would be in reduced presence otherwise, including nitrogen-fixing species. We have a release of nutrients when we have fires sweep across the landscape. We have a reduced occurrence of fuel loading on the landscape, which means when the next fire comes through that it's not as severe as it would have been had we not had that fire. Fires produce charcoal, and charcoal is an issue near and dear to my heart. Charcoal has a number of beneficial attributes to it that most people don't consider. Number one, charcoal stimulates seedling germination and growth. It holds water and nutrients. It also stimulates microbial activity in soils, including the stimulation of an important function in the nitrogen cycle. And lastly, it stores carbon. If we think about wood storage in soil, once a tree falls on the forest floor and begins to decay, it lasts in the soil for on the order of tens to perhaps 100 some years. When charcoal is deposited in soil environment, it has a mean residence time or lifespan measured in 3,000 to 12,000 year periods. It's extremely stable material and thus can be looked upon as a carbon storage mechanism. Fire is a natural disturbance. Our low elevation forests burned historically on a mean fire return interval of about 15 to 35 years. Those are our dry ponderosa pine, Doug fir forests, or our dry montane forests. Our mid-elevation forests burned on a fire return interval of about 80 to 200 years, depending on where in the landscape you're talking about. So these mid-elevation forests to upper elevation forests have not missed a fire cycle. So when people talk about fire suppression and the effects on the landscape, they're really talking about the effects on the low elevation forests in terms of fuel accumulation, not on our mid or upper elevation forest ecosystems. We generally talk about forests, and when we talk about fire suppression, we say that we have this heavy fuel loading, which is true. In a lot of our second growth forests, we go out in the woods and we see something like this dense growth of Douglas fir. And when we have a fire in that ecosystem, we wind up with stand replacing forest fires that are where we have very severe conditions, the loss of the forest floor, and a number of other impacts that we wouldn't have had in a natural fire at that low elevation dry montane forest. perhaps more akin to what we'd expect in some of the mid-forests that would have burned on that 80 to 200 year fire return interval. If we look at an old growth forest, this is an old growth forest from the Frank Church Wilderness and the Ponderosa Pine Doug Fir forest type that has been exposed to one fire in the last 120 years, but was never entered for forest harvest. We have a completely different picture on the landscape in terms of the density. Yes, the density of Douglas fir has increased in these stands, but not to the degree that we see in the second growth forests. This is an example of the second growth forest. You can see all the small trees in the overstory and the heavy introduction of Douglas fir in the understory. So the point here is it's not just fire suppression alone. It's a combination of historic timber harvest and fire suppression that has really led to this heavy density of forest stands, and it requires a different look in terms of how we might go about restoring those ecosystems and trying to get resiliency on the landscape. One last thing is that these dry montane forests were relatively patchy and are not the norm in western Montana, but rather account for perhaps a minor percentage, more like 10 to 20% of the forest type on the landscape, not the dominant feature which we might expect in forests of Arizona, for example. This is just a slide of the dry montane forests in Montana, and it's kind of washed out. I don't know how it looks to you from in the back of the room, but basically you see that the dry montane forests don't account for a whole lot of the public land in western Montana. The public land is noted in gray: national parks, wilderness, and roadless. Well, it's hard to differentiate. White are federal lands, but it's not separating out well. The take-home message here is that the colored pixels are the dry montane forests. And where are they dominating? In eastern Montana, not in western Montana, interestingly. Just the point here is it's not the dominant forest type on the landscape. How do we restore resilience to these dry montane forests in western Montana? How do we make sure that these don't go up in a cloud of smoke when we have these fires that move across the landscape with greater frequency with the occurrence of climate change? Well, the restoration treatments are appropriate on those forests that have missed more than one or more fire return intervals and that have mature trees present. In these forest ecosystems, we would seek to protect the large, mature legacy trees while trying to get fire back on the landscape and use a combination of silvicultural treatments and prescribed fire. We can also do that same type of treatment in some of those second growth stands that are at the sapling and pole side stage with pre-commercial type treatments and try to get those on the right trajectory so that 100, 200 years down the road, they're looking as a condition that we might want in our dry montane forest types. We would advocate a stewardship contracting model where roads and aquatic restoration might be paid for through the receipts gained from the treatment of the restoration treatments conducted on these dry montane forests. I'd emphasize that forest restoration is a young science, and it's going to require a lot of humility. We can't assume that we know the answers with regard to forest restoration. Rather, we need to monitor the outcomes of our forest restoration. We need to conduct ecosystem monitoring of the outcomes of our forest restoration and adjust accordingly as we move into the future. Just briefly, resilience and land preservation. Land preservation is an important component of our landscape protection against the effects of climate change. We've heard about it already. I'll just briefly say that large, intact natural landscapes provide the opportunity for vertical and horizontal migration that's going to be absolutely necessary for species to handle the effects of climate change. These ecosystems also reflect clean pure water storage at high elevations, and carbon storage in the form of old-growth forests. We'd also advocate heavy or aggressive treatment of those areas in the community fire protection zone, as these communities have to be one of our first priorities, or our first priority. We have defined the community protection zone as that area that's a quarter mile around communities. In Montana, I just use this example from the Seeley Lake Ranger District that demonstrates the area in red is the community protection zone. The other colored areas are second growth restoration priority sites that we've identified through the use of a tool that we've recently developed for prioritizing treatments on the landscape. The point here is that reflects a fairly large area that requires fairly aggressive treatment to protect lives and communities and the lives of firefighters. Wildland fire use is should be used where appropriate. This is areas far from communities and where fires should be allowed to burn to reintroduce the natural function of fire or allow fire to take its natural course. This will ultimately save money, lives, and it will ultimately store carbon. If I had time to talk more about this, I would, but I'm going to just call it good for now. We're also involved in collaborative approaches on the landscape, and we've dropped off copies of a little brochure that describes the Blackfoot Clearwater Stewardship Project that actually represents an example of this collaborative work between communities, industry, agency, and conservation groups trying to get restoration from a fire resilience perspective and reinstating natural function, community safety and planning, and land preservation in terms of, as I discussed earlier. With that, I'll go ahead and call it good and open it for any questions that you might have.
Thank you, Tom. Yes, are there any questions at the moment? Yes.
When we have a major fire, there's a tremendous amount of timber that is completely burnt, and that timber is allowed to stand, as opposed to allowing a timber company to come in and salvage those burnt trees. I don't understand the philosophy behind that.
Yeah.
Could you explain that?
Yeah. First of all, I'll just mention that there are fire salvage sales that have been approved. That there have been. There's examples. I mean, you could drive by mills and see charred trees in the yard currently. So there are some fire salvage sales that have gone through. I understand what you're saying, though. There's a whole utilitarian aspect of the trees are dead. Why not take them? There's a number of reasons that these trees play a role in the ecosystem function, and I'm not saying that we shouldn't do treatment on salvage treatment in some cases. There are places where it would be appropriate, but there's no ecological benefit of salvage logging. There are a number of ecological detriments. If the treatments are done, if the salvage treatments are done in the wintertime, you can protect against soil compaction that is caused by the equipment, but you're going to lose one rotation of carbon from the system, which to us, we think, well, what's the big deal with losing a rotation of carbon? But from a soils perspective, forest soils depend on an introduction. Let's use a lodgepole forest as an example. Soils depend on an introduction of carbon once every 200 to 300 years as a function of the blowdown or beetle kill or fire. And those soils and their long-term sustainability are completely dependent upon that. There's also habitat that's created by the snags that are left behind. There's benefits from a water storage perspective by the trees being left behind and creating water holding capacity in the system. So there's a number of ecological benefits of leaving the trees. But there's also, as you're suggesting, a utilitarian benefit, and that has to be balanced.
In my experience, in the last 20 years of observing the Kootenai National Forest, I very seldom ever see major stands that have been burned completely ever being allowed to be removed. And also, I noticed that the Forest Service tends to have a habit of going into an area and burning the underbrush and allowing the second growth trees to survive. But my thought is, what happens to those baby trees that get burned up when you're burning the underbrush? How do we ever get a second growth forest if you continually burn the undergrowth and you're burning up the small trees?
Yeah. Well, the use of prescribed fire generally is I think you first mentioned that they burn the forest, they burn the underbrush, but they don't, it tends to be, prescribed fires tend to be fairly patchy, and they rarely kill all the trees in the forest, for one. And they tend to be fairly low severity, given that they're done at times of years when there's less likelihood of an escape of that fire. The benefit of burning the brush and the trees is that you're reestablishing that natural, you're trying to reestablish that natural cycle of fire that would have come through and maintained that cereal stand of, say, ponderosa pine, while allowing those younger firs to be consumed by fire, with the idea that that's what would have naturally, given those 15 to 35 year fire return intervals, that's what would have naturally existed on that landscape. Clearly, after 350 or 400 years, that ponderosa pine may die and fall in the system, and your question is, where are the trees going to be to take its place? But there are trees that escape that fire effect, and it's demonstrated by the history recorded by the presence of those large, mature pines with the branches starting up, some 20 feet on from the ground surface. That they're a fire-resistant or resilient species, and they're a fire-adapted species, and they have evolved to be able to exist in that environment. I hope that sort of answered your question. So.
Maybe we'll get another crack at Dr. DeLuca here at the end of the panel. How about another round of applause? Thank you. Our next speaker is Ellen Engstadt, who has been supporting the forest industry and the forest management community for a long time. She's a friend, and I'm a forester, and I'm someone who really believes in using wood, and it's a wonderful product, and I'm hoping that Ellen is going to enlighten us on some opportunities to keep our forest industry going.
Thank you, Jim. At least I don't have to be, what was it, charming and creative or something along that line. That takes a lot of pressure off right from the get-go. I would like to thank those of you who organized the conference for the invitation. It seemed like a long time ago when the invitation was issued, and then I thought, oh, well, that's months away. I'll have all kinds of time come September. Here we are, it's September. But I do thank you for the opportunity to be part of the program. Right up front, I'll say I'm not a professor. I'm not an economist. I'm not even a forester. But I do proudly represent the timber community in the state of Montana. There are two organizations, the Montana Wood Products Association. We represent the sawmills and manufacturing end of the timber industry, and there's also the Montana Logging Association, and they represent the contract loggers who do the work on the ground and get the materials into the mill. I'm going to follow the outline that I had sent in that is in your printed materials. I will just do the do the heading and then a brief, very brief, so I don't get the 2-minute wave, comment about each of those headings. The first one, somebody said it's a subject near and dear to their heart. How can climate change be a subject that any of us want to even talk about anymore? But climate change, reality, or hysteria? The world's climate has been changing since the beginning of time. It's sometimes warmer and sometimes cooler. The interesting twist in the discussion that began a few years ago, first as dire predictions of global warming, and then the substitution of climate change verbiage is, and I think it was the attempt of those who were trying to frame the debate, started feeling that this was slipping a little bit, because weather patterns since 1998 simply do not substantiate the global warming theory. I'm seeing a lot of frowns. Graphs and charts do, however, indicate that the climate does cycle, wherein during long periods of time the weather can be severe. Obviously, these trends have an impact on forests as well as humans. So that gets us to what constitutes a healthy forest. Healthy forests are probably much like beauty. It is in the eye of the beholder. Mixed ages of different tree species with snags and forage for critters is part of the equation, as is the ability of the landscape to process and provide clean water. Hundreds of stressed stems per acre where moisture cannot even get to the ground, thereby denying habitat to forest animals, does not constitute a healthy forest. If the goal is to provide clean air, clean water, and safe wildlife habitat, catastrophic wildfire is not the answer either. Hundreds of thousands of acres of dead, red, beetle-infested trees also is not healthy. It would be to the benefit of humans and wildlife to actively manage Montana's forests. So how does active management produce a healthy forest? Improving growing conditions, controlling stand density, and increasing tree vigor are all part of active management and increase forest health. And yes, active management means human intervention through logging and other activities on the ground. The modern means used by the timber community and by private landowners like ranchers, who are stewards of their land, is landscape sustainability. There is a need to reduce forest densities to keep trees healthy and to minimize both fire risk and insect outbreaks. Active management means reforesting immediately after harvest or natural disasters and keeping forest land in forest use instead of losing the land to development. The offshoot of active forest management is the ability to produce wood products for consumption. We all use wood products every day, and for energy that could be generated from biomass. All of these options of active forest management serve to provide many positive attributes in the climate change discussion, including carbon sequestration. These options range from long-term storage of carbon in products like building construction materials for homes and businesses. But if looking for carbon sequestration in forests, the key to remember is that young forests have the capacity to take up much more carbon than old trees. And that does not mean that there should be no old growth left on the landscape, because there is definitely a role for old trees. But by thinning and having varying age classes, the forest as a whole would be more healthy and more productive for carbon storage, as well as greatly reducing the risk of wildfire and bug infestation. What are the tools available to federal land managers? And I will go on a little bit longer on this one because it's an important act to those of us in the timber industry. And that was the passage of the Healthy Forest Restoration Act of 2003. Virtually all of the language in the HFRA, in some manner, contains public input and participation and local collaboration. This piece of federal legislation was written to encourage active forest management beginning at the local level by those most affected by lack of management in their communities. That is why it is so puzzling to those of us who believe in public input at the local level that there are those who so strongly resist it. Projects under HFRA are developed by local residents, public officials, and agency personnel using a collaborative approach. The Middle East Fork project in the Bitterroot National Forest is an example of an HFRA project. The residents in the valley, along with the Forest Service, developed a landscape-level project alternative that would benefit their small communities and provide some positive forest health benefits. An EIS was written, including a no-action alternative, the preferred alternative, which was the one developed by the citizens, and a third conceptual alternative provided by a coalition of preservation groups. Without going into extreme detail here, the local citizen preferred alternative was selected and the projects moved forward. A lawsuit was filed in an attempt to stop the Middle East Fork projects, and while the case has moved from Judge Malloy's court to the Ninth Circuit because the plaintiffs did not succeed at the district court level, the stewardship contracts continue to move forward, benefiting both the resource and the communities. There are many myths regarding the HFRA, and they have been debunked over the course of the past 5 years since its passage by Congress. One myth is that HFRA eliminates public involvement in projects. My example of the Middle East Fork is a clear indicator that HFRA requires public input at the local level and specifically encourages people to become involved early in the process rather than waiting in the weeds until the last minute to file an appeal or a lawsuit. It's a very transparent and citizen-driven process. Another myth is that the National Environmental Policy Act, or NEPA, is gutted. Headlines that the Washington Post likes to use when talking about Western issues. We're gutting our environmental laws. Again, there is no truth to that rumor. HFRA requires environmental analysis for every project. The difference is the analysis is focused on the proposed agency action rather than on numerous, endless alternatives. It seems like common sense to me. So I would say HFRA does not need revision. It is a good tool, but it does need more extensive implementation by the agency. The National Forest Management Act, this statute, unlike the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, does need some revision. I think Martin made some good points regarding that. It was passed in 1976 and is basically supposed to be a planning document for more inclusive forest management through forest plans. All of the forest plans in Montana are badly outdated, and because of failed attempts to revise forest planning rules in 2000, 2005, and now the 2008 version I don't think has even been allowed to be tried, it appears more and more apparent that NIFMA needs to be looked at in a serious manner and most likely revised to better reflect current values. Along that same line, and I think the study produced by Jim and Martin suggests that other acts along with the National Forest Management Act should be looked at too, and I would say probably maybe even NEPA. I know that's almost criminal to say, but perhaps that should be looked at, or at least the regulations implementing NEPA. The Appeals Reform Act, Equal Access to Justice Act, the Endangered Species Act, they all have one thing in common, and that is they have been in existence for a long time, and some scrutiny probably would be a really good thing to see if they still should be in effect or if they should be changed. Federal fire policy, succinctly put, a realistic federal fire policy needs to be implemented either administratively or legislatively that does not spend 50% of the Forest Service budget annually on firefighting. The policy must address public and firefighter safety, resource protection, and proactive management of the federal lands in question. It is simply not in anyone or anything's best interest to have millions of acres of land burned each year, pumping millions of tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. Again, if those who are so concerned, and I think we're all concerned about climate change, but for those who speak the most loudly about all of this, they probably should be leading the charge to slow down the collateral damage of catastrophic wildfires plaguing our country and our state every year. Montana wildfires in 2007 cost millions of dollars, put an estimated 47 million tons of carbon dioxide into our airshed, and no one has even been able to put a number or a dollar amount on the health risks to our citizens breathing that kind of pollution. These are issues that could and should be addressed in a federal fire policy. But as usual, time is not our friend, but rather time is of the essence. Public participation in federal land management decisions, and this is the last point. This is a very important point to be made, and that is how the public fits into the equation of federal land management decisions. It's very important to those of us who rely on some resources off of public lands, but as a citizen and a native of Montana, it's very important to me as someone who uses the public land for personal purposes as well. In the ideal world, all citizens would have the time and the inclination to become involved in all of the issues. But we all know this simply can never be the case. There must be a process in place, and there is, whereby those individuals who are interested in participating are encouraged to do so. Federal agencies routinely put out notices of proposed actions on public lands and ask for input from the people. Those who are sincerely interested in commenting and providing constructive suggestions on projects sometimes do comment. More often, it is the special interest entities claiming to represent the public interest that pick the bones off the project, relying on the outdated and overlapping regulations, and it's usually in an attempt to stop action on the ground. To me, that is not public participation. In an effort to move forward and away from that type of obstructionism, federal land managers have started using several different approaches, including the collaborative effort of local folks as described in the Middle East Fork project under HFRA. This is the best approach because it truly puts the decision-making at the local level and in the hands of those affected most directly. The key component to any collaborative effort must be the final result of action on the ground. Otherwise, the effort is strictly academic, and while that can be worthy, it does nothing to provide crucial activity for the benefit of the resource or the citizens. It is encouraging that more and more collaborative efforts by sincere individuals are underway because federal land management decisions should not be made in a vacuum, and public participation is a critical component in those decisions. But the end result of the efforts must mean sustainable, active management of the public lands for the benefit of all Montana citizens. Thank you.
Are there questions for Ellen?
I have a comment.
Yes, sir.
As usual. And I totally agree with you, Ellen, in your assessment there. want to get back to some of the original decision about Plum Creek being integrated into the National Forest program. And I'm really concerned about this prospect. Why? Because if you look at the condition of the health of of the forests in Plum Creek lands as compared to the condition of the health of the National Forest lands, it's like night and day. And let's face it, trees, regardless of what a lot of people might think, trees are a plant that possibly takes longer to grow than a vegetable, but it is still a plant, and it has to be managed properly, and it has to be salvaged properly. And I would hope that some of the people involved in making up these decisions on behalf of the Forest Service would possibly bring in managers from Plum Creek and associated timber companies to find out what their secrets are in producing a healthy forest.
A question or another comment?
I was curious how the health of a forest could be in the eyes of the beholder. Wouldn't it be in the eyes of the scientist?
I think I said it was equivalent to beauty is in the eye of the beholder. I look at green trees as very beautiful, very healthy. I like them horizontal sometimes rather than vertical.
Thank you, Ellen. Our final speaker has come from Phoenix to be able to participate in the conference, and we're delighted to welcome Rebecca Tozzi, who is a professor of law and the Willard H. Pedrick Distinguished Research Scholar at Arizona State University, and also the executive director of the Indian Legal Program at the Sandra Day O'Connor College of Law at Arizona State. Rebecca, thanks for being with us.
Good afternoon, and thank you so much for inviting me. I have to admit that when initially Jennifer and Michael contacted me, I told them, well, I don't specialize in public lands law. I really do federal Indian law. And so let me give you a whole list of people who might be better qualified to talk to the audience than I would. And they were very persistent, but so kind and so supportive that I just had to say, okay. So I have prepared some comments for you, and then I spent the lunch break revising what I had prepared for you. In light of everything that I had heard, what seemed very important. And I also want to acknowledge my good colleague, Professor Ray Cross, for the great work that you do for all Native nations and for the program and the students that you support here. It's an honor to be here, and there are a lot of very, very powerful Indian nations throughout the West, here in Montana and Arizona, where I'm from. And it's quite a responsibility to have to speak to the multiple tribal interests that are out there, and that was one of my hesitations. So I don't even purport to do that. I know that Professor Cross is leading the discussion tomorrow, and anything that I omit, he will remember and share with you. What I really want to talk to you about is the ethics that ought to guide the whole conversation and how Native nations fit into that. And our topic, of course, was forests and climate change. And I have done some work on climate change, and I've been to conferences for probably the last 2 years. And I've been to the conferences where people say, climate change, does it exist? And they put up a bunch of graphs. And then I've been to the conferences with the Inuit people, and climate change really does exist when all of your land is basically melting and the traditional lifeways can't be maintained. And there's never been a comparable event to that in the whole history of humankind. Then something is absolutely happening. But the next question beyond that is, well, to what extent do we really have to care? Because, of course, under all of the models, there's so much uncertainty. And I'm glad that we have somebody who can speak to the science of this on the panel, because I had to ask many questions to the climate change scientists who were reporting back from the national and international reports about what went into the various models, because I'm not a scientist. And the best that they could tell me was that it depends, which is something that we're used to as lawyers hearing. It depends on the one hand, on the other hand. But what does it depend on? It depends on so many things, right? It depends on, yes, the emissions, CO2 emissions, and how many power plants come online in the next 10 or 20 years. But it also depends on how much forest land there is and what the integrity and the quality of the waters are. It depends on all of those things, and it depends on those things globally. And so as I started to do the research for this paper, I actually saw the statistics on the rate of deforestation internationally and what's going on with Native peoples in Central America and South America, with Native communities on the land in India and China. And the problem is so huge. I mean, it's absolutely huge. But what really is true is that whole way of thinking that said, let's move Native peoples off of the land and then let's do something with the land other than what they were doing to maximize whatever the goals are that we think we ought to have. And you've seen commentary on the different perspectives about that in this country over the past, 100 odd years since the Forest Service was established. And I think 100 years, that's not a whole long time. And it was just amazing to me that in the conversation since last night, I got two separate versions of this land ethic that's guiding this 100 years. And so John Leshy was talking about the progressives and their ethic for public lands. And he said they had this concept of holding them in trust for the future generations and using them as a means to support a social ethic, right, which is democracy. And then how are we going to reconceptualize that in the modern era? And that led to a lot of what we've been discussing about public participation and communities and citizens and all of these wonderful features of democracy and access. And then Karen Sheldon talked about the ethical imperative for what she called an age of restoration. And that really intrigued me. What would an age of restoration look like? And I think that one of the things that we would need to do in an age of restoration is to actually recognize the connectedness of all of our people's lands, forests, and communities. And on a national scale, we can sort of almost understand that now. I don't know that we do that on an international scale very well, but I want to talk about the connections, obviously, between tribal forests and forests on public lands, because essentially those are the same resources. And secondly, in terms of the global conflicts or national conflicts over management, who are the consumers? Who are the beneficiaries? Who suffers the harms? The answers to those questions ought to be present in that so-called ethic of restoration, right? But are we willing to engage that discussion? And finally, the kind of equitable context of that, and I know that that's something that a lot of people don't want to engage. They don't want to engage the equities. But there are very powerful histories that undergird all of this, and I think that we don't even respect ourselves if we can't encounter ourselves on the land as we have met each other throughout the years. And certainly we need to make an effort to do that internationally in a respectful way, because we really can't know. We can only find out from other people. So I want to talk about that. In terms of the situation with native forests and native lands, I'm going to do, I think, three things with the presentation. First of all, I want to talk a little bit about how national policy kind of filters over to tribal lands. And so, what's tribal policy look like versus public land policy? And then secondly, I want to talk about the statutory framework that does guide tribal forest lands and the intersections with public lands policy. And then finally, I want to talk about the interjurisdictional conflicts. And I think those are some of the most interesting case studies, and it's been interesting to hear the commentary about the limitations of jurisdiction, right? That governments sometimes can block efforts, and so how do we promote cooperation among governments and understand, what that should look like. For environmental policy, natural resource policy, as we would understand the national expression and then the impact on tribal communities, the impact of national policy has traditionally been one that goes out to tribal, it goes to public lands first, and then it has spillover effects on native communities. And those spillover effects can be very, very negative. So let me give you an example. Uranium mining, right? Federal government heavily involved in that from the 1930s all the way to the 1970s, first in the defense industry, and then in commercial nuclear power. Uranium exploration was going on public lands, but the regulations were actually more protective of miners and the land, if you can believe that, than it was on tribal land. On tribal land, it was virtually not regulated. So tribal land is under the trust responsibility of the United States, under the jurisdiction of the U.S. Bureau of Indian Affairs. No laws protecting miners. They knew that it was going to cause death and sickness. No protective laws, nothing. They left open tailings piles. People built their houses out of the tailings piles, totally not regulated. So that's what I mean by a spillover. Now, what was the effect of that on tribal governments? A significant amount of contamination, a significant amount of need of resources to clean that up, and continuing health impacts. So there are various versions of that with coal mining and other forms of extractive industries. The mechanism that tribes have used to deal with that is basically sovereignty claims. So in the 1970s, tribes litigated, they lobbied for congressional legislation that would essentially recognize their right to be treated as states for purposes of exercising regulatory jurisdiction on the reservation. And there were various executive orders and secretarial orders basically affirming a government-to-government relationship. That went a long way to allowing tribes to do what they needed to do to protect their members, their lands, and to deal with the problems of the past. That is what we would call the domestic version of environmental self-determination, domestic dependent nations, cooperative federalism to some extent on the level of the state-federal relationship. Now, obviously, the jurisdictional constraints there are significant. So while federal public land statutes do allow for consultation with tribal governments on various issues and therefore recognize that relationship, it's not the same as having regulatory jurisdiction. And so there are problems in terms of that. And sometimes those interests get presented as basically moral interests and not legal interests. And case in point would be the disputes over what are viewed as sacred sites on public lands. And so I'm going to talk a bit about that. Now, in the area of forest policy specifically, and I mean here I think that it's very interesting to me to look at policy in terms of various components, right? So you have the ethical component, you have the economics, that component, and then what we would view as a scientific component. What are the analogs for native nations? Very similar. On the other hand, in terms of scientific understandings, there is a very close relationship between the forests and the people. They have been on the land for a very, very long time, thousands of years. And so those scientific interests are expressed as traditional ecological knowledge in many cases, but it is a form of science and experiential relationship. In terms of the federal policy, I'm I'm really glad that other people have set this up so well. But essentially, I want to reflect back to the policies as they're embedded in the federal statutes on public lands, the Multiple Use Sustained Yield Act of 1960, sort of encapsulating those concepts on federal public lands, the National Forest Management Act of 1976, which, as I understand it, was that sort of more contemporary wave, which was synchronized or harmonized with the policies of NEPA, right, as that environmental charter. Well, what are we going to do? We're going to, look at the interests at a national rather than strictly regional or local level, right, because we think that environmental interests are present at that national level. Secondly, engaging the need for a planning process and really taking on what that required in terms of public participation and access. And finally, that really, I think, a more refined explication of whatever the relationship might be between development, the need for development, and the need for preservation or conservation. I think that Professor Kiter did a wonderful job of talking about the various regulations and kind of the contention between the Clinton administration's version and the Bush administration's version, so I won't belabor that, only to note that even now there's this discourse about, well, what is ecological sustainability, and how would we actually turn that into enforceable standards if indeed we could? Right? How would we make that happen? The question about stakeholder interests and private constituencies, citizen groups in that whole discussion. And certainly the tribal views were encapsulated in both versions of that, both the Clinton administration and the Bush administration, in terms of the need for consultation and dialogue about particular interests and modes of conservation. Forest fire management, others have talked about that. Obviously, federal public lands, forest lands are adjacent to tribal lands in many, many cases, which led to the most recent legislation that I will talk about in a moment. Now, taking those policies, the national policies, and then looking at, well, what was the extension, what was the analog on reservation communities? I think that here you see an initial event, and this is where I think you need to go back to history, so that the United States government basically opened lands to the public domain by removing tribes and having the reservation system and basically saying, you know, you guys are going to settle the country, and here's the land, it's open. And then they went into the conservation mode, right? Let's have federal public lands for the public. The impact of that on tribes was the same. Let's move the tribes so that we can have public lands. So public lands, national forest lands, National Park Service lands, those were carved out of treaty guaranteed reservations in many, many cases and set aside by executive order from larger reservations to tribes in many other cases. So you basically, that's the equitable situation. Those were tribal forests for a very long time until the 19th century, the late 19th century, early 20th century. Now, when reservations were created in their sort of current configuration, that guardian-ward relationship that has characterized that paternalistic 19th century version of federal Indian policy kind of kicked in. So tribal forests were really considered a form of federal property. And if you go back to early cases, United States versus Cook is a famous one in 1873, whether the Oneidas, you know, in that case they had cut down some timber and sold it to a non-Indian. The United States government sued for replevin, and the court said, absolutely, the United States government owns those logs. The Indians had no right to sell. They are tenants with a right of occupancy. That's the interest of the United States government, and they get the logs back. Later cases actually carved that into something a little more favorable. They said that they owned it in trust for Native people, and so the Shoshone case basically said tribal timber is tribal. They get the beneficial interest. They get the money and the resources. The legislation on tribal lands, the act of June 25th, 1910 is the long-standing Timber Act. on tribal lands. And basically that covered both trust land and allotted land. And I think that most people know that many reservations were allotted to tribal members, and also lands were sold to non-Indians, which results in that very harsh pattern of ownership, fee land owned by non-Indians, allotments owned by tribal members, and tribal trust land on many reservations. What was the policy that to guide the federal government? They called it sustained yield policy. If you look at the implementation through the Indian Timber Sales Act of 1964, there is a heavy emphasis on economic viability of the forest, that we really want Native people to be economically self-sufficient. Timber is a resource that you can sell and use and market, and therefore that's the emphasis. Now, there were many problems with the administration of those lands, which I won't go into. They were the subject of a variety of trust litigation, damages claims against the United States government for mismanagement. And if you look at the essence of those claims, oftentimes the lease agreements were they weren't publicized, they were way below market value. So there was significant trust breach there. And the 1983 Supreme Court decision in United States versus Mitchell basically said, yes, the U.S. government is liable in damages for trust mismanagement. Okay, that's, 2 minutes, good, okay. Can it go just a hair over that? Okay, thank you. I will be brief. That trust mismanagement set up the modern era, and that is the National Indian Forest Resource Management Act of 1990. And that statute basically says, hey, the U.S. government abides by the self-determination responsibility. We want tribes to assume the planning process. So it was a little version of the 1976 federal statute basically telling tribes, you guys make the decisions, you guys create the plan, you guys figure out what's a good policy, and we're here to support you. That's what the trust means, we're here to support you. And that sounds really, really great, right? Okay, well, they had a report about what the problems were, and it won't surprise you to know that the comparative sample for that report was how well is the U.S. federal government doing on federal lands, how well is it doing on tribal lands. That was the comparison. And I haven't heard a glowing report on federal lands yet, but that's the comparison. And it turned out that on that scale, tribal lands were way, way, way below the management that was happening on federal public lands. So the amount of funding was very insignificant. And here's the takeaway message on that policy. The Bureau of Indian Affairs has the budget. Do you know what happens to the Bureau of Indian Affairs budget when we're at war? When we have to bail out all the financial institutions? It shrinks. The Bureau of Indian Affairs budget has to cover everything: education, health, fires, whatever. So you can imagine if public lands is way down here, Indian lands is even further down there. So there's almost no money. And so basically that's just one of many, many problems. But as we all know, nothing happens without the funding to do. So if you take over management planning, you have to take over NEPA responsibilities. How much money does it take to comply with NEPA? A lot of money. Can you comply with NEPA if you don't have any money? So that really wasn't factored into the wonderful self-determination policy, is that now with all these duties, well, where are you going to get the money to do that? So there are many problems that I could go into about the statute and its implementation. The idea is great. The implementation is very rough. The Tribal Forest Protection Act of 2004 is the other specific statute relevant to tribal lands. And that one is designed basically to complement the Healthy Forest Restoration Act, basically protect fire areas because of the contiguous boundaries. It's been enforced for 4 years, allows tribes to contract with the secretary to basically restore federal lands adjacent to the reservation. The tribe has to meet several criteria, showing a risk of fire and pests, et cetera. Some cultural concerns are part of that. There have been 10 contracts in the last 4 years in several regions, so at least some work is happening, and that is under a stewardship contract model. Okay, I know that my time is up, and if I had had more time, I would have talked about the interjurisdictional conflicts. That is the tribal presence on public lands. And what I want to say about that is that there are still treaty rights that accrue to many public lands. There are rights of access. There are rights to hunt, fish, water. All of those rights are still present on many public lands. Sacred sites, that is a misnomer for continuing cultural, historic connections that basically do give rise to an ethic of place that belongs to the land. So ought we to care about sacred sites? Yes. Is the Forest Service concerned about that? I certainly hope so. In the wake of Navajo Nation, I was just on a panel. We could not get anybody from the United States Forest Service to appear on that panel in Arizona after Navajo Nation. But as all of you know who've been following that case, Ninth Circuit en banc upheld spraying billions of gallons of treated sewage effluent all over the San Francisco Peaks, sacred site to 13 plus Native nations in Arizona, to create artificial snow for the ski resort, which is in a desert area in an era of climate change. And that has devastating environmental and cultural repercussions. So I seriously encourage you to think carefully about the ethics of restoration for the future. Thank you.
I'd like to open it up especially for some questions for Rebecca right away. Yes, Ray.
Rebecca, first I want to thank you for your short talk. I'm sorry you didn't have more time to talk about Navajo Nation, that issue. Let me suggest to you and see if this is something that you think might be worthwhile pursuing, and maybe in your next law review article or somewhere else. You suggest that there's been a wedge driven between, on the one hand, the idea of a land ethic and public land law, or ethics and law. And you also adverted to the trust duty in Indian law as an aspiring bridge between ethics and the application of law. It's still an aspiration that's yet unrealized. Would there be a similar model, a paradigm between ethics and public land law, in which a sort of overarching trust duty, a fiduciary duty, would unify the laws? Say we got all this fragmentation, conflicting mandates, old laws, new laws, and yet one theory of that would be to say that you have to square the circle by bringing ethics in line with the law. And the fiduciary duty, which is an effort in Indian law to do that, align the political action with the interests of the Indian beneficiaries. Would there be a similar theory for public land law to say, in the light of climate change, in the light of the changed circumstances and impose new responsibilities and new risks, that we should have a sort of fiduciary set of laws that private attorney generals and Indian tribes and affected stakeholder groups could use as a basis for sort of resynthesizing law? Not the statutory mandates that are primarily music-oriented, but a new idea of an ethical overarching principle similar to the idea of federal trust duty that's supposed to protect the Indians from the misdeeds of executive action.
Mm-hmm. Professor Cross, that's a wonderful suggestion, and I would really encourage the next step in that. What would that look like? So if we crafted a view of the trust on public lands as one of a fiduciary, we would absolutely have a foundation to build a normative basis that was very rich and obviously located in place and in what the connections are of these local communities to the place, and that would be inclusive. I think that the first generation, and Charles Wilkinson has written about that, the first kind of generation, the progressive generation, about what the trust looked like at that idea, that was really a genesis for those people, that they actually thought that there should be a robust trust in these public lands. And there was an effort to kind of table that and suppress that out of a utilitarian norm, right? That somehow we had to extract the value of the land in terms of development that trumped the genesis of that. But what if we went back to that? What if that was the new progressivism, that we just actually went back to that and the citizens said, no, we think there's a more robust view of the trust. At that level, I think that the interests of Native people and local communities would absolutely be more harmonious on public lands if you could view that. Because, for example, in the San Francisco Peaks case, the ski resort was paying a very, very low rate of lease rate. I mean, I can't even tell you how low it was. And it was a marginal profitability. There really aren't that many people. They go to Aspen and Vail. They don't go to Flagstaff. So the fact that you would actually not engage some kind of a balance there in terms of the harms to the land, given that view of development, I mean, it's just insane. So maybe you could use the trust in that instance. So I think that's a very creative idea. I'm absolutely supportive of creative ideas, and I will definitely think about that in my upcoming article. Thank you.
Thank you, Rebecca. Let's just open it up for any general questions and comments for the panel. I know we've had quite a day here today, but I think there's been some really evocative things said, and I would like to hear some commentary. People are tired. Well, let me offer this from my own point of view. It seems like a lot of people here have spoken about some ability to look at opportunity for reform. There have been injustices, there has been difficulty in funding, there has been controversy, there is uncertainty, and Martin and I have proposed, let's look at the Forest Service. Let's have this thorough examination. Yet now when I hear Rebecca's presentation, Tom's and Ellen's, I see, and from the questions, that perhaps we need to broaden this. But does that make it too big? Does that make it difficult and unwieldy to deal with? What is a strategy for a new administration? I mean, I was taken last night by the commentary that a new administration's got bigger fish to fry than public lands, and that's indeed true. They're going to deal with war and peace. They're going to deal with the economy. They're going to deal with issues of education and health that are really critical to Americans and needing attention. So perhaps this is a very opportune time for reflection. But even how that reflection is organized might be an important question for us to address and provide advice to our leaders. Do we pick on an agency? Do we address long-standing tensions with the American Indian population? Do we deal with an industry that is in deep trouble in many parts of the West? How is it that we even go about looking at public lands in an organized way while we have this kind of period of reflection laid out in front of us? Has anyone reflected or thought about that? Perhaps best over a couple of beers. That's the way to do it. Yes, thank you.
I haven't thought about that, but I did want to tell you the last time that I heard Rebecca speak, this was at a conference at the University of Colorado, and she talked about how there might be very different basic principles that could work in constructing relationships with public lands and could also be at work in constructing legal principles. And she was speaking from the standpoint of Native people's relationships to and with their landscape and the responsibility that they feel to and for their landscapes. And I thought at the time that it was marvelous, and I had always wanted to thank her for her comments because I appreciated them so much. And they stood in stark contrast to our Eurocentric notions of the relationship between human beings and property, property being defined as land and objects and resources and sometimes even human beings, unfortunately. And that if we had created a system of laws in this country based on Native American approaches to our environment and the relationships and responsibilities that go along with that, what a very different set of laws we would be dealing with today. And the case of Johnson versus McIntosh, which when I was teaching public land law, I always led off with, in which Justice Marshall legitimizes the conquest of this wonderful continent and the taking of property from people who had been here for thousands of years, were managing their environments in a very good way. What if that decision had been different? What if instead of John Locke as our model for sweat of your brow into property gives you property rights, responsibilities and relationships to the environment and all of the other living things that crawl and fly and walk and exist, what if that had been our approach? What would we be talking about today? And how can we, going forward, integrate more understanding from the experience of Native peoples over the millennium, not only here, but in other parts of the world. And so this is a chance for me to say thank you to Rebecca for influencing my own thinking and really having a profound effect on my own view of public land law and how I teach it and how I think about it. Thanks.
All right, we would like to thank everyone for being here today, and we are excited to see everyone back again tomorrow morning at 8:30.